Also raise your hand. We can, because this is a webinar, we can give you access of the microphone and then you can speak directly to our host at the end of the presentation if you want that. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Jane and Andy. So our first speaker is Dr. Jane Ndungu. Jane is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Gender and Health Research Unit at South African Medical Research Council. Her research focuses on violence against women and girls, prevention interventions, where she seeks to promote the inclusion of beneficiaries in the design of interventions. Jane is also involved in other activities aimed at strengthening VAWG research in low and middle income countries, such as being part of the independent advisory board of the WorkWorks second program and WHO temporary advisory roles. And together with Jane, we also have Dr. Andy Gibbs. Andy is a social psychologist applying theories and approaches to understanding and addressing a range of global health challenges, particularly behavioral and structural interventions focused on violence against women and girls and HIV prevention treatment. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter, an honorary associate professor at the Institute for Global Health at University College London and at the South African Medical Research Council. He is also an honorary research associate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Now you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Colin, for such a warm introduction. I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you need help?
I'm trying to turn on my video here.
Sorry, what?
I'm trying to turn on my video here, but it seems not to work. You can help me with that.
That's fine.
It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, I think, let me check.
Okay. As we do that, thank you very, very much for such a kind introduction. I'm very, very excited to be part of this discussion today. Thank you very much for inviting me and challenging me to think through this very complex issue, which I must admit, I hadn't thought about as deeply as I did after being invited to this talk. So thank you, actually, it's an honor. I'll share my screen now. Bear with me just for a minute as we do that. Okay. There we go. So I have split my talk today to two broad strokes. The first one being openness to research process, and the other one, openness in the research dissemination. And the reason I split my talk like this today is because when I was first invited to engage with you on this topic, my initial thought was data, access to raw transcripts. And I just thought, no, there is absolutely no way I'd be open to sharing transcripts where participants have been very generous and kind, intimate thoughts on such a topic, sensitive topic, and traumatized participants at that. So I didn't think there was a way. But as I thought more about the issue and engaged with colleagues as well, I was able to broaden my thinking beyond data to the research process and in charity. And I realized that to some extent, we have been open, we've made very broad strides in being open in the research process. But there's only so much we can do. There's limits to that. And there are some aspects of the research that we might not be able to share, especially qualitative research. So then I'm being guided in my thinking by three questions. To what extent is this openness? Are we being asked to be open in the research process? On what exactly, on what phase, on what aspects of the research? And to whom and with whom should we share, be open in this process? And we will look at those in turn in the following slides. So thinking through the research design, my work is usually guided by co-development, where we work with participants and users, if you like, of the research process, of the research outputs, right? So we have redefined the research team to include community representatives, practitioners, scientific team that brings in scientific knowledge, and anyone we feel that would be beneficial to improving the quality of the interventions. So what we end up generating from such a collaborative process is work that is more contextualized and more reflective of the participants, of the end users of the interventions. So these interventions end up being more reflecting of their realities. So in this co-development process, and when I refer to the research team in my thinking throughout this presentation, this is what I'll be referring to, this collaborative group. So in this process, we normally work together in a very transparent way. And we're able to come up with, for example, the research questions. We think through the research, the problem that is important to them in their context, the problem that they feel is most urgent to address. We think through funding opportunities with the group, and depending also on what the fund requires of research, and we pick on funding opportunities that are more accepted. And we also think through things like sample identification, where we collect the data on whom, with whom, what areas should we focus on, what would be our research procedures, what days can we collect the data, and what other days might not be so convenient, things like that. So we think through the entire research process with the team. So in that way, I'd argue that in that specific aspect, we are open in how we conduct our work and how we think through the research problem and addressing the problem. But there are some aspects of the research that we might not be able to share outside of the research team, right? Especially when we think of data sharing, thinking through what data are we being asked to divulge and to whom, and how much data are we divulging, the extent of it, right? So when you look at the research team that we have here in slide 1, when we work in, for example, I'd say co-producing a theory of change, right? We're able to, everyone in that room has access to that data. So we're able to share that data with everyone that is represented in that room. But we might not necessarily be able to share with it to the general public, right? We might be able to share maybe the diagram of it, but not the recordings that emerge from such a process. So when you think of qualitative data management, which is quite different from quantitative data management, we need to think who has access to this data. So for example, we've had, when you want to publish a paper, sometimes peer reviewers will ask for the transcripts, which I'd argue it's a bit difficult for us to be able to share that with reviewers because you don't know where the reviewer is based. And it might very well be that that peer reviewer comes from that community, and there's only so much de-identification you can do of transcripts to make sure that we are not able to identify a certain participant. So even if you ascribe a code to the transcripts and remove names from the transcript itself, because we already know the context, the place, the location the data was collected, reading through that transcript might itself render identification of the participant, which we don't want. So it might be very difficult for us to share transcripts. And I'm still grappling with that issue of sharing transcripts. I don't still see how that will be possible. I know, but I'm open to learning. Maybe there are ways that I haven't thought about. We also need to think, what is the purpose of sharing this data? Why does this group or entity want access to the data? For what purpose? and what's the extent of it? Because we have been able to share excerpts of transcripts where we have quotes. And we've gone as far as providing the quotes in the language that the data was collected. Say, for example, if we collect our data in isiZulu, we're able to provide the excerpts in isiZulu and then translate it to English for non-isiZulu speakers. So that we have been able to be open about. So what other extent do we need to share data, more data, and for what reason? How will it be beneficial to the public domain, given that we already do provide the general outcome of the research and trends that we have identified in that research? Then again, thinking about data storage, where there's an increasing call to store our data in servers where there's public access. Are we able to do that with transcripts? And I'd argue not. I think it's still very risky for us to have our transcripts publicly available. And when you think about, again, of the research dissemination and being open in this process, when we publish our work, we're able to provide excerpts, like I've briefly touched on, we're able to share that. But, there's a twist in the conferences where there might be avenues for being open, but this is not upon us, right? So for example, we've seen at conferences where participants, people who have experienced violence, have asked to be part of conferences and share their stories. And that data would be as raw as it can get, right? But then that burden lies on the participant or the person who's experienced violence and wants to go and share their story. And this usually comes from them. We don't ask that of people, because we do know that there are some people who find benefits to this, who experience healing from sharing their stories on such platforms. So if a participant does want to share their stories on such a platform, then at that point, there's an avenue for being very open to that specific data, right? But of course, we must caution the participants on the extent and the limits of confidentiality from sharing their story on such a platform, including the fact that such a platform might have recordings, and we might be able to record that conference, and that will be publicly available forever. Actually, the internet never forgets. So if after that they're still willing to share their story, then yes, at that point I'd argue there is an avenue for openness. So having said all that, I've always grappled or struggled with the issue of who should actually be making decisions on the extent of sharing, because we don't know that data. I don't own the data of the participants that I collect. They are the owners of these stories. They're the owners of this data. And I think they do have the authority to argue or to make decisions on what should be open and to what extent and to whom and with whom, right? And we, as much as we researchers do have a responsibility to protect participants, we must not also forget that they have the agency to make decisions on such issues, and we must not take away that agency from them. So if we are going to be true and to openness and in a safe manner, I think research participants need to be central to this discussion. I think they should be making this decision. I think they should be guiding us. We should obviously be able to give them all the information on limits to confidentiality, the risks of being open with this data, the opportunities and all that. Then they can make a decision on this, because I think they do have the agency to do so, and they should be the authority. So it would be important for us as researchers and funders and everyone else who's involved in this discussion to also bring on board end users and participants as we think through this issue. And I'm very grateful to all the participants, researchers, practitioners, funders, and publishers who, despite the numerous challenges that we experience, remain resolute in their efforts to ending violence against women goals. I'm also very grateful to our funders, the Wellcome Trust, NIHR, South African Medical Research Council, and South African National Research Foundation. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'll hand over to Andy now.
Great, thanks, Jane. Really interesting. And then I'll pick up from there and kind of dive into this question about what do we do about co-development data in a similar, well, a slightly different argument, but same kind of topic, and I'll try and keep to time. So yeah, thanks also for the introduction, range of funders. And obviously this kind of work we've been doing over the past few years involves many, many colleagues, although I'm the one speaking. So to kind of talk about this, I want to go through three things, really give a bit of background around what does co-production as open science, think about that slightly, and then think around knowledge as being co-produced, and then questions about the challenges of reproducibility of that knowledge and what does this mean for making science open or data open. So just to give you a bit of background and kind of context to the communities we're working in, lots of the work I've been involved in with colleagues has been around violence against women in urban informal settlements. You know, to give you a sense of the prevalence, you know, lots of women experience exceedingly high levels of violence. When we've done studies, we often get around 50% reporting past year experience, which compares to about 10% in South Africa at the national average. Obviously, we understand, or you know, half of our work is understanding the social, economic, and political factors driving these rates and marginalization, so forth, kind of structural violence. And then what we're really interested in is thinking about how do we co-produce interventions with young women to address violence in their lives and support them to navigate the constraints they face in ways that are health enhancing to them. So the picture on the top right is a facilitator from a project many years ago. And this is kind of typical shack selling bits of food. That gives you a bit of background to it. What do we mean by co-producing violence prevention interventions? I guess what we've tried to do is start to systematize it, to try and think, you know, how can we theoretically understand what co-production is, and then practically implement that. Because there's a lot of talk about what is co-production, lots of kind of grand ideas, but what we were trying to do in our work is get theory backing up some very practical action. And I want to take you through this briefly, because it really gets at the heart of some of what we're trying to do and what we mean by co-production, and therefore the co-production of knowledge, and gets us into kind of debates about can we make this data accessible to all and open. As Jane's kind of given you a sense, you know, the idea of co-production is about really getting lots of people who are often excluded from formal scientific knowledge together to engage. And some of the work we've done, including with Jane, is try and write that up as in terms of 6 ideas. So really, one is around developing voice and critical analysis of those engaged in the process. I think lots of people engaging, particularly if they're socially marginalized, struggle to have a strong voice and critical analysis of the situation. You know, and a lot of time needs to, you know, in almost a Paulo Freirean way, focus on building people's senses of voice and critical analysis to help them understand the context they live in and the causes of their problems. So a lot of work around co-development is about building that. It's about building receptive listening spaces where those with power, academics typically, but also practitioners, have this space, are willing to listen and not simply dismiss or kind of apply their own form of interpretation to kind of knowledge which is being produced. And the argument goes that when we get voice and critical analysis together with a receptive listening space, dialogical engagement can emerge. And it's that dialogical engagement where different forms of knowledge and interpretations start to occur, which is kind of the co-produced knowledge and co-produced ideas, which is what we're kind of getting at. How can we make this open? Can we make this data open in other ways? I guess there's also, we want to just flag 3 other bits: recognition of multiple forms of knowledge, which is something I'll talk about a little more in a minute. Obviously, in all these co-production, co-development processes, there's power inequalities. We can never escape them, have to recognize and try and work with them. And a lot of that's over interpretation, our power to interpret. And then the process, recognizing that no process is perfect. No, but as we've worked with practitioners, with academics, and with young people, it's often with young people, young women themselves, the idea is that if we can at least engage with these 6 ideas and put them in place to some extent, through dialogue, we can co-create new knowledge and meaning, and eventually interventions which work to address kind of violence in women's lives. And this SBRI knowledge exchange, fully available online. So that's the kind of background. So the idea that we come together to build something new is really important. But what does that mean about knowledge? I guess one of the things we often think about with knowledge is, we have it there, it's an object which we can grasp. And that's what the assumption about making knowledge, or one of the big assumptions, and it certainly is with quantitative data, that once we have a thing, it's an object, which is one static interpretation. And you can come and look at it in different ways, but similarly, the kind of knowledge that you look at is kind of relatively fixed. And yeah, we need to think of co-production and the co-production process as a social constructivist kind of approach. If we go back to some classic work on what's the interview, the research interview, as Brinkman and Cavell say, is an interview where knowledge is constructed in the interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. And I guess we often forget that. We often think that knowledge that gets produced is simply knowledge which sits there, but yet it's being constructed and made in particular contexts and only has meaning in those contexts. So I guess, what does that mean for making co-produced knowledge data publicly accessible? And I want to give one example to kind of think through that and then suggest some potential ways. And I'm happy to be told this doesn't make sense or you need to think about it in different ways, because it's only something just started thinking about. Let's talk about one thing, or 2 things, 2 photos. So in one of the processes, or a couple of different processes, we've done this, what we call artifact creation process. We've asked young people to take photographs, videos of things that are meaningful to themselves, select the top 10, this is over kind of a couple of months, they'll send them in via WhatsApp. They'll then select individually their top 10 photos that they've taken or videos, and then tell us about it. Tell us why it's meaningful to them. So we started to get, at times, from these young women, photos of their boyfriend's laundry, and I can also see a child's bib there, but a range of laundry and photos of them doing cooking for their boyfriend, and we start to think about, how do we interpret that? So for us as academics, when we saw this as clear examples of gendered inequalities, the exchange of domestic labor, the economic and social support, or what have you, and when we looked at that, this is how we interpreted, this is how we made sense of it. But for the YPRAs, when they selected these photos and talked about the meaning ascribed within these photos, something came across quite differently around the expression of domesticity, and love in the context of what was often very tenuous and complex relationships. When they got to do the washing, when they got to do the cooking, For them, it was a chance to formalize, to kind of mark that this relationship with this guy was somewhat real. And I guess, you know, how we sit that together is the process of co-creating, obviously not to deny the wider gendered inequalities it sits in, but that meaning and that interpretation can only happen through that, that discussion. And this interpretation is not within the formal archive, not within the data set. It didn't necessarily happen on one of the transcripts. And I guess the question becomes, you know, where kind of meaning of things like these photos gets produced in spaces where there isn't formal data, and yet are incredibly important, and it only can be truly understood through that joint meaning making. You know, how can we make photographs open? And we talk about some of the other challenges of co-production in the paper at the bottom that my colleague led. And I guess, what does this mean for co-production and open science? Hopefully I've kind of tried to make the point that simply putting, you know, data in a repository will not work, because a lot of the meaning ascribed to that data, you know, cannot be separated from the context that it's been created in. It's often not formally recognized data. It's not in any formal archive, you know, and that extends to questions around violence, you know, interpreting violence and working in these very complex situations. So I started to think, what might openness look like of co-production in terms of data and kind of more widely? So obviously one of the big things is about the process, challenges and successes, not simply a linear narrative of success. Often you read these papers and it's like, you know, we were incredibly successful and did this wonderful thing. And actually a lot of openness about kind of co-production, particularly around violence against women and girls, needs to be about the complexity where things went wrong, where we had clashes, where we had misinterpretations. So as we create things, whether it's knowledge, whether it's interventions to address violence against women and girls, people can understand how it came to be, which gets onto the second point, you know, space and writing up to provide, you know, what Gibbs said, you know, thick description. You know, often as I've been writing papers, trying to make sense of the co-production process with young, marginalized young women, we've been hit by word limits, word count limits. And one just resubmitted, I had to cut 1,000 words off, you know, even though it had some of that rich text and depth in it. So it's about providing thick description so we can get challenges and success. And that can also be about data. So the ideas of what do those, you know, the cooking pot, the laundry, the meaning behind that can come in, not just simply through looking at photos. And then I guess it's about producing multiple different outputs, enabling different kind of understandings to come through. You know, if we think back to the laundry, you know, is it possible to create an archive where that photo has the different interpretations that we've ascribed to it, both the YPRAs, who gave their one interpretation, as well as kind of the academics and the practitioners, who gave another set of interpretations. Obviously, this has massive implications for time and money and hosting and things like that. But I just want to, you know, finish there because I can run out of time, acknowledge kind of obviously a massive team who've been involved in this, both research practitioners and many, many young people who've been involved in various co-production things. So I'll leave it there. And yeah, look forward to having people's thoughts and comments on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're gonna listen Rosa Targett, who is a research associate at the University of Bristol, who recently submitted their PhD thesis titled Encounters at the Intersection, Sites of Struggle in the Development of an Intersectional Praxis. Their work engages with violence in its various forms and the role of the body in political struggle, and their research interrogates social relations from an explicitly queer feminist standpoint.
Okay, now Rosa, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay. Oh, sorry, hang on. So, thank you to Colin and Isabella for having me, and thank you to everyone for joining this conversation, and thank you also to Jane and Andy for excellent presentations. I am really excited to be part of this important conversation. I was asked to join this discussion to bring a community work perspective. Sorry, my camera's going a little bit weird. I can't tell which one's looking at me, so I hope I'm looking at you, and if I'm not, then sorry. I was asked to join to bring a community work perspective, but I'm also an academic, and at times it's impossible really to separate these different roles out, but I have tried to focus my presentation as much as possible on the practicalities of engaging with gender-based violence survivors in ways that are mutually beneficial, rather than the research-specific theoretical and ethical approaches, so much of which has already been covered brilliantly by Jane and by Andy. So here's an overview of what I'll discuss. There's a brief content warning, and then I will introduce myself in more detail and briefly talk about my own work. Link to some of the big questions of the complexities of open research as ethical research, much of which has already been covered, and then talk about some of the issues that I've experienced in the work that I do with survivors. So issues of representation, how we conceptualize violence, the types of research methods that people use when studying this topic, and then also issues of reflexivity and well-being as well, on behalf of the person who is conducting this work, whether it be research or community work or activism. So a brief content warning. You are all at an event focused on survivors of gender-based violence, so perhaps it goes without saying that I'm going to be talking about gender-based violence. However, one of the things that I want to discuss with you is the potential toll it can take if you work in this area. This doesn't mean that I'm going to discourage anyone from engaging in this sort of work, which is vital. But it does mean, for me, being upfront about some of the content that I'll be discussing so that you're mentally prepared for it. And specifically, I want to be clear that I will refer to my own experiences of violence and being a survivor, not in any graphic detail, but I will refer to them occasionally, and I want to flag that in case anyone's expecting a purely abstracted account of violence. So, I am Rosa Targett, and I'm a research associate at the University of Bristol, and I tend to focus on various issues of violence. As well as being a researcher, I'm an activist and a community organiser, and I also teach at the University of Bristol, primarily focusing on research methods and ethics and social harms. So all of my work focuses on issues of violence, mostly in the UK. And I do a lot of work with and for local organisations in Bristol, where I'm based as well. Some of this work tackles physical violence, such as organising with Sisters Uncut to protest national government defunding what are still referred to as domestic violence services. But I also do work that tackles some of the less well understood manifestations of violence as they are experienced as trauma. And this includes state-inflicted violences of underfunding community resources and over-policing vulnerable populations that can have hugely destructive impacts on both bodies and minds, as well as the institutional kind of big isms, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, all those microaggressions that make up epistemic violence, which over time is experienced as existential threat and harm. I do this work with activist organisations, but also with more formal institutions such as Bristol University, working with the Feminist Men Project, Bristol Women's Voice, which is a local organisation, local charity, part of the Bristol Women's Commission that analyses local gendered relations and pushes an equality agenda, and various others as well. So some of the organisations that I've been involved with are on the screen there. And I really started in this work as an activist more than anything else. First with Stop the War Coalition, focusing on the types of gendered violence that war facilitates and encourages. That was 20 years ago now, with the UK invasion of Iraq. And other activist groups such as Fight Abuse Bristol, No More Page 3, which was campaigning to remove topless photos of women from the Sun newspaper, and Sisters Uncut. Some of these organisations have been more problematic than others, and I'll touch on that a little bit in terms of my own research. But the other aspect of my community work has been teaching, and that's outside of my formal teaching role at the university, working with young people, such as with the Creative Youth Network, partly focused on teaching young people how to recognise warning signs for intimate partner violence and coercive control, and partly focused on the ways that gendered representations create the context in which particularly violence against women and girls is legitimised. So I think that because I sit between the community activist role and also the researcher role, I'm quite aware of the fact that my research interests are born out of the community work and the activism that I've engaged with. There are lots of injustices that I don't face personally that I try to counteract in my work, but I am also a survivor of gender-based violence of various types, including intimate partner violence and sexual violence. I've also had those experiences that I would estimate about 100% of feminine presenting people will have had, of random violence, including street harassment and flashing and groping, as well as violence within institutions, including sexual harassment from colleagues and superiors. And I think the first thing that we need to be aware of when we're engaging in this type of work is that gender-based violence happens everywhere. And while we might be focusing on one specific type of gender-based violence, all of those experiences of gender-based violence do combine to make an overarching experience. So while we can research the different types, we need to remember that one type of violence often happens in conjunction with many other types. And that can happen in any context. So I had a recent horrible experience of harassment that happened within my own university in front of my students and my colleagues and superiors. This is an issue that, broadly speaking, is totally endemic. And what this means is that community spaces where this type of violence can be escaped and discussed are absolutely vital to survivors. However, community spaces tend to be constructed in the same ways as all of our other institutions, and so are vulnerable to the same power dynamics that reproduce other forms of violence. And that's what my research is about, and it's also something I want to discuss with you as potential researchers moving into this field, to make sure that you don't reproduce some of the more subtle harms that contribute to overall harms to participants. So my PhD work came out of a lot of these questions that I've already covered about, what are the harms that are reproduced when we're trying not to cause harm? And I use Sisters Uncut as a case study to explore the practical mechanisms for trying to avoid social harms in shared spaces. It was a very complex process, and made more complex by the fact that my original focus wasn't so much on experiences of surviving gender-based violence, but obviously in the context that I was working, most of my participants are survivors. And because of their membership of this specific group, they also experience higher levels of targeting from the state in the form of, for example, police interference. So this convergence of interpersonal and state violence meant that I couldn't even fulfill some of the most basic expectations of research council ethics in order to behave ethically towards my participants. So, for example, I didn't ask participants to sign consent forms because it was too risky for them to have their names written down anywhere associated with the research project. And so for that reason, I either sought oral consent on a recording or in person in a much less formal interview situation that wasn't audio recorded. Where interviews were audio recorded, in some cases, participants weren't even comfortable for that data to be stored on university systems. So there were a number of hurdles that I had to navigate with regards to the absolute basics of conducting ethical research as it's understood by research councils and universities that would not have been ethical in the context of my own work. I've also done some work on Jamaican sex workers' experiences of violence, and I worked as a research assistant analysing primarily quantitative data. And I mention it only briefly because I want to come back and refer to it later, but my primary role was to analyse survey data that had been designed and collected by the Sex Workers Association of Jamaica, because they needed some stats to make a case to their government about the types of violence that sex workers were experiencing locally. And that was actually in addition to the project, which had originally been designed as a purely qualitative project, but what came out of that was that participants needed some quantitative data. So, open research. There are context-specific implications of a participant being recognised. So we already know from discussions about this in terms of research with other vulnerable populations that researchers' abilities to anonymise data are questionable. And I've worked with data archived in a research repository, both as a researcher and in my role teaching research methods to undergrad students, and have been horrified actually by the extent to which participants could be identified if you chose to identify them. For me, all of the usual reasons for justifying the risk as being worth it for the benefit that you get from sharing data go out of the window in a context where we have to consider the implications of making research participants identifiable to their abusers. And there are also personal implications for researchers who are survivors. So I think that it's really important that when we're conducting this type of research, we understand that we have to move away from some of the broader debates and really get into the complexities of what we're talking about. Beyond the issue of anonymity, survivors often have serious concerns about engaging with institutions because of previous negative experiences with police or caseworkers or social workers or other state bodies. And so, for example, as I mentioned in my own research, participants didn't even feel comfortable to have interviews stored on university systems because there were so many instances where they'd been institutionally let down that to risk having that happen again was to risk perpetuation of the trauma of surviving abuse. So it's vital that researchers engaging in this type of work are invested in protecting participants first and foremost, and then build a mutually trusting relationship on that basis. And what it comes down to for me is, why are you doing this work? If you are invested in eradicating gender-based violence, then you should be eradicating trauma for survivors from your research process. And if these aren't your primary concerns, then there are countless fascinating research topics to engage with instead, which are far less high stakes for participants. And again, not to discourage anyone from doing this work, but I think it's important that as people engaging with vulnerable populations, we really interrogate our own motivations for doing this work. So I will come back to the ways that data can be more open, perhaps with less risk later, but I want to highlight some of the important things to consider before embarking on any work with survivors. So a lot of what you will need to know about representation as researchers in this field has been covered by Jane and Andy in their really insightful discussions of the necessities for co-production and the complexities of that process. However, there are a couple of specificities that I want to add in as a survivor and a community organiser, and that I think everyone researching this topic should be aware of, and that includes an understanding of those already working in this area in other contexts. So those who are doing this work but aren't researchers, such as activists and practitioners, and making sure that you recognise that they are experts in the field as well as you. So an example could be terminology, and if you're working in this area, you probably have come across the victim-survivor thriving debate. Language and labels is a complex topic with regards to any vulnerable or marginalised group, and this is no different for survivors of gender-based violence. Moreover, terminology changes all the time as relationships with labels change, labels are co-opted, or people theorise about social relationships or events in new ways. So I have been and will continue to use the word survivor in this talk and in the outputs from my PhD research, because that is the term that my participants use to describe themselves. But there was also a sense that being labelled a survivor was to be allocated a single role, as though identification with that term serves to limit the possibility of other identifications. And so it's really important to me to be led by participants when it comes to terminology. And if this means that you can't use a general term to refer to all participants in a research output, then that is a complexity that should be embraced. Representation is always important in the unequal power relationships that research process represents, but more so when someone allows you a level of authorship over their experiences of oppression. Representation is also important in terms of how we conceptualize the violence that others experience. So recent academic literature on gender-based violence and intimate partner violence tends to take an intersectional approach to demonstrate the ways in which different forms of identification and corresponding marginalizations impact on who tends to experience gender-based violence and what the specificities of those experiences will look like. And this is a positive step in that it complicates our understandings of experiences of violence, and it allows us to interrogate state responses to violence, as in who can get away with perpetrating gender-based violence and what, and who can't. But I argue that it doesn't go far enough in how we need to conceptualize gender-based violence and intimate partner violence for research. Having survived violence is an intersection in and of itself, and experiences of that intersection vary according to a multitude of other experiences and identifications. So, for example, while it could be argued that studying gender-based violence means that we are discussing gender more broadly, I would make the case that anyone can experience gender-based violence depending on the context. And so we need to be clear about what constitutes different types of violence in our theorizing to avoid potentially writing off the experiences of some because they don't fit our expectation of what violence looks like. Given the understanding that gender is far more complex than a man-woman binary, we need to be open to forms of gender-based violence that don't necessarily look like traditional gender-based violence. So, for example, there are some masculine presenting populations that are more likely to experience what is specifically gender-based violence because it's violence perpetrated in rejection of a gendered expression, but it falls outside of violence against women and girls, which is what we often think about when we're discussing gender-based violence. The same goes for violence experienced by gender non-conforming peoples, regardless of sex assigned at birth, gender identification, or gender expression. This is a group that experiences high levels of violence specifically due to gender. And these examples, I include them to undermine arguments calling for appropriate action on violence against women and girls, levels of which are staggeringly high globally. But I do feel that it's important to bear in mind that these are some of the complexities of the ways that gender-based violence are experienced, and we should be open to these as part of our investigations. This requires that experiences of violence are recognized as discrete forms, often perpetrated in conjunction with other forms. Combining to make that overall experience that I mentioned earlier. So combined conceptualizations of violent experiences and the language that we use to describe and explain them are the basis from which we represent our participants. There are countless reasons for why research should be co-designed with participants, and I'm not going to rehash the case that Jane and Andy have both made really eloquently. But even in such cases, in terms of research outputs for an academic audience, it's still often the researcher as author who has the final say, even where there are negotiations with participants about co-meaning making and what goes into these outputs. And that's why it's so important to be led by participants on how their experiences should be represented. And I'd add that this amounts to better research. Jane has already mentioned that Proper representation means that your research more closely reflects the lives of your participants. So the closer you are to their experiences, the more valid your findings are, the more the research will speak to other researchers in this area who are conducting sound ethical research, and the better for your career. And that is a pretty cynical point, but I think that it is worth bearing in mind on the days when it's really hard to do the extra work of considering every angle of representation, because this is a complex thing to engage with. So different methods equals different outputs, and I want to raise a couple of things to think about in terms of research design, and then I'm going to describe my own approach to this work and why I think it's something more of us should be doing. The first question is, have you designed a method that benefits your participants, and how do you know? And the best way to know, obviously, is to design it in conjunction with your participants. It might be that any particular method is the right one for your particular study. So there's a lot of gender-based violence research that's qualitative, but for example, my own experience on the project in Jamaica taught me that there are reasons why participants might need some quantitative data. And if that project hadn't been working directly with an organization that is able to collectively set an agenda and articulate their needs, that data may never have been collected. And another way of best establishing what methods will be helpful is to gain prior knowledge of those that you're working with by engaging with community or activist groups before finalizing your research design. So go and speak to people. What is the work that they are doing that is helpful for those communities that also could serve you as eliciting data for a project? And those are some of the things that you might want to think about before even engaging with participants to find out specifically what they want from your research project. There are also, you need to give some thought to the issues that you'll likely come across. So, for example, are you expecting high or low levels of disclosure? In some cases, participants might resist sharing particularly personal accounts, and that carries its own issues in a research context. In the case of my own PhD research, my experiences of surviving gender-based violence meant that disclosures were particularly high. There are positives and negatives to this, so it's really important to be prepared. For example, the positives of mutual disclosure is that I was able to form really strong relationships with participants that facilitated the shared meaning making that we're often seeking. And we found ways of generating humour out of negative personal experiences that was personally beneficial to both me and to my participants. However, this meant that the data I was left with was in places more harrowing than it might have been if there had been less disclosure in terms of details. And that had negative implications for my own well-being during particularly transcription, coding and writing stages of the research. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but reflecting on that process, I think I would have spent less time on the talking methodologies and more time on the making methodologies, which brings me to making a case for creative research methods. So I like to employ creative methods in my research and other community work, particularly around issues of violence, for a number of reasons. The first is that embodiment is inherent in the process of making, and embodiment is inherent in experiences of violence, and it's important not to forget the body in the research process. So creative methods are a really useful way of keeping the body at the forefront, which is necessary both to ensure participant well-being, but also for yourself if you've experienced violence yourself. Reflexivity, so there's a wealth of research now that shows the creative process is incredibly valuable in a research setting because it encourages a level of personal insight that isn't available during a traditional interview or focus group. And that's not only useful for your research in that you get extra depth, but can be very helpful for participants in that the making process allows them to process their own experiences in a new way, which often encourages a level of healing. And finally, joy. The making process itself is incredibly joyful. When you're engaging with such a depressing and traumatizing topic, finding ways to bring joy to participants and experience it yourself can get you through the work with your own sanity intact and allow you to continue doing this important work going forward. That is an image of the front cover of my fieldwork diary for my PhD research. And because I was using creative methods, I extended that to my own reflections and decided to zine the research process. So whatever reason you're engaging in work with survivors of gender-based violence, you need to give some serious thought to maintaining your own well-being. I've already mentioned the usefulness of creative methods for encouraging reflections in participants, and the same is true of researchers. But I was asked here specifically after another event on researcher safety and well-being. And at that event, I discussed my own experience of researching gender-based violence as a sensitive topic, particularly the experiences of vicarious trauma that researchers experience in the research process, sometimes in interviews, but also through the transcription and coding phases, particularly in transcription, because when you are listening to traumatic experiences and you're listening to them over and over again and having to transcribe them, you have a huge amount of input of trauma. What that means is that you need some structure in place to help you maintain your own mental health. And in my own experience, there was a lack of mental health provisions at work and a struggle to get counselling from the university, a lack of acknowledgement that what was necessary was a clinical intervention into what I was experiencing, which was a very natural response actually to engaging in this type of work. If you are having a negative response to listening to accounts of trauma and violence, then you are behaving in a psychologically healthy way, but you need some support to work through that and so maintain your mental health. And honestly, the creative process was a huge support for me throughout the process of doing the research. So by creatively engaging with the content of my research, I was able not only to process the vicarious trauma I'd experienced in productive and healing ways, but that also became a space to work through complex research problems and to develop arguments and theory build. So, and finally, making a case for creative outputs. So one of the best things about creativity in the research process is that participants have total control over the final work. And so as long as they don't sign it, for example, it's much easier to anonymize an interview transcripts. Some of the work that I do is predicated on the idea of sharing that creative work. So going into it saying we're creating works for an exhibition. And what that means is that there are spaces for participants to express their experiences in ways, less traditional ways, that are less open to some of the complex issues that we face in terms of open data. However, we still have the issues of representation to consider with regards to the complexity of meaning making that Jane and Andy discussed. And I would argue that any researcher who hasn't been a part of the data gathering process probably won't have the necessary knowledge to represent participants in ways that aren't harmful to them. So key takeaway points. It is almost impossible to see how open research can be conducted with survivors of gender-based violence while fully protecting participants and researchers as well. Representation matters, and that requires that you take cues from participants and foreground co-production. To speak about gender-based violence broadly is to risk reifying expected or most common forms of violence as the only kinds, and there are a multitude of experiences within the broad conceptualizations that researchers should be on the lookout for. Community spaces are vulnerable to the usual power differentials that we experience within social relationships, and this means that researchers need to be extremely careful not to cause harm when entering these spaces. Methodology should always take into account what participants need from the research process as well as the research outcomes. And creative methods can be beneficial to both participants and researchers. And finally, as well as that of participants, your own safety and well-being when researching this topic is paramount. Make sure that you have mechanisms in place to preserve your own mental health. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rosa. That is really good forming and informative and great presentation. And as I think everyone can see, we have some positive feedback in our chat box. And we also got some questions. Our first question is, I think this one is for Rosa, because It's in your research with Jamaican sex workers, was this inclusive of trans community, nothing the religious and cultural barriers? And if so, what has been the response in publishing this data, working on this project? And I also enable your mic access. So if you want to talk directly with Rosa, you can speak.
Thank you, Ashley, for your excellent question. Yeah, it was inclusive, and one of the areas that I contributed to interpreting the data was that my own community work in this area had made me more aware of issues of gender identification and representation in relation to experiences of violence. I also am a queer researcher, so I have some awareness more broadly. So yeah, so there were lots of trans participants who were trying to articulate their experiences in ways that the PI and the co-Is hadn't quite understood. And that was actually one of the areas where I needed to intervene and say, you're not quite understanding the complexity of what's going on here in terms of representation, particularly of trans women. And primarily that was an issue of the researchers taking their understanding of gender identification more from the way that it's described by the Jamaican state than how participants themselves are engaging with labels. And the second part of that question, oh, well, I mean, in terms of religious and cultural barriers, they were enormous. Probably not enough time to go into them here. Publishing the data, so actually it's been stalled since COVID. We were working on a number of qualitative publications that I need to follow up on and see what's happening, because it was all stalled by the complications of COVID and remote working, and everyone fell out of touch. We did publish a policy paper with Policy Bristol that included some of the findings from the quantitative data, but the qualitative data is yet to be published from this specific project. Although it's a continuation of a project where there are publications on the topic. So Julia O'Connell-Davison and Katie Cruz are the names to look for.
I just want to thank you so much because I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is neighboring to Jamaica. And I think this has really been a major issue in trying to figure out how can we highlight these issues, but also noting, you know, the very real barriers we face. So thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing that.
Oh, thank you for that feedback. I'd be really interested in having a conversation with you further if you want to email me.
So we have another question for Rosa from Marvin. How do you deal with transcription? Do you transcribe the recordings yourself? How do you navigate issues around recordings and transcriptions?
Yes, I transcribe recordings myself. I now, in less sensitive research, I work on other things that are tend to be a little bit less sensitive, and in those situations sometimes I seek permission from participants to use a transcription service or software like Otter. I think that navigating issues around recording and transcribing have to be context specific. So what are the threats that your participants face? In my case, the university was perceived as threatening. You have to find ways to navigate that. And quite honestly, sometimes that means bending institutional rules in order to behave ethically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have another question. So we have been discussing a lot about co-production, and Jane and Andy, you mentioned about it in your presentation. I was wondering if you could provide some practical guidance on how to do co-production with our participants.
Jane, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll do that. So I think you are maybe speaking in reference to the question in the chat box on, and I'll touch on a bit of those questions that have been raised. For example, gender and how it might affect the space, the co-production space. And I'd say it also depends on some context. Some cultures are very specific to the gender in the room. For example, I've worked with post-migrants from Somali. And in that space, it's very important for the gender in the room to be similar to the participants. For example, the women want to work with women, and no men in the room, they feel safer when it's only the woman in the room. And that's very important because the paramount issue is to, like Andy mentioned, ensure that there is a receptive listening space. And in order to allow for that to happen, there must be safety experienced by the participants. In order for them to be able to speak, they need to feel safe, and they need to experience trust. And if that's the gender they want in the room, then that's going to be very, very important. So, and if there's a mismatch, it might have the participants not being forthcoming with information or with revealing or speaking about their experiences more openly because they don't feel safe. And how do you make them feel more comfortable in the room? I'd say, and we've spoken about this in another talk, one of the main issues, and I think Rosa and Andy also touched on this, is ensuring that there is power balance in the room. Because in some spaces, you will feel, for example, that the scientific team has got more power. So you need to be able to balance this in order to make sure that the participants feel like important contributors in the space. In fact, maybe more paramount, if you like, because they are the people who understand the context better, right? And Andy, if you want to add more.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I guess bits of practical aspects of co-production. I guess one of the things we've found working with young people here in very kind of complex situations is that we have to spend a lot of time almost not working directly on the thing we're wanting to work on, but really building their ability to think about and interpret their lives. You know, it's very hard to kind of dive straight in and say, you know, so what do you want to do about this? You know, we were having a conversation yesterday with other people who've done similar processes. And I think one of the struggles is that we've found that young people struggle to imagine alternative, better futures. You know, they're so bound up in their ways. The idea of imagining something better is often very, very hard. So we've spent a lot of time really working through building their own capacity to think and reflect, and to think about their lives and what, you know, future alternatives could be before drawing them into a more formal kind of co-production-y type process. So that's one of the key things. I guess I also just wanted to say, you know, co-production is wonderful and it's central, but we've also found that, you know, it produces particular forms of knowledge, which are great, really important, you know, but when we've also done more traditional qualitative in-depth interviews, we find out quite different, we learn different aspects about people's lives. So we'll do qualitative interviews with other young people, say from the similar communities and backgrounds. And that kind of more disembodied interview, you might want to say, produces different data to the co-production data. And I think it's important to see co-production as being one way of producing knowledge, which is incredibly important, but other ways, you know, and it's a bit like Rosa said, the quantitative data also produces a form of knowledge which has very important uses. It's just not about saying one form of knowledge is better than the other, but they all help us look at these issues in different ways from which we can get a better understanding. So they are two kind of more practical aspects of co-development I wanted to raise.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I think you both touched a little bit on this issue. Rosa, do you have anything you want to say about this question?
Yeah, I think that Jane is absolutely right in that, you know, we often are talking about violence against women and girls, and often that means creating spaces where there aren't particularly cis men in the room, so that people feel comfortable to share their experiences. I also think that to a certain extent, gender mismatch, as you phrased it, is always something that happens between two people, because our expressions of gender are so wildly different. But that feeds into a wider discussion about power and the researcher-researched relationship. And for me, I suppose in this context, I'm quite privileged by my sort of status as a survivor, in that I am able to utilize my own disclosures, my own understanding, to make participants feel more comfortable, to make them feel as though I'm going to understand their experiences. And I do think that in this context, that absolutely is a privilege. So I think it really depends on who you are, what your experiences are, and you know, who you are and what methods you use, and all of those things feed into what's going to come out of it. So it doesn't really matter what your gender or your experience or any of those other identifications are, so long as you're aware of them and you are paying attention to how they've impacted on the research process and the data collection, and as long as you are prioritizing participants. So yeah, so I would say it's all about reflexivity, not trying to get rid of some of these complexities.
Thank you very much for your answers. We also have another question here. So, Rosa, you talked about different gender and sexual identities. How do you think we can take consideration of the nuances different ideas about ethics different identity groups have?
Yeah, and also Andy and Jane, if you have any thoughts, you can
Yes.
also answer.
I mean, I think it's rehashing what we've already discussed, but for me, that has to be context specific. You've got to be led by what participants are telling you as their experiences, their identification. So there is no one size fits all. The only thing you can prioritize is going into it, asking participants to learn from them rather than trying to impose your own ideas.
Andy and Jane, do you have anything you add?
Not really. I think Rosa gave a good answer. I think she's spot on it.
Nothing from me, I'm covered. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to share.
Okay, yeah, I think in that case, we don't have any more questions. Now I think on the screen you can see a QR code, which is a feedback form for our session today. And yeah, and if you want to, yeah, and also we have our emails. I think Rosa shared the emails in our chat box. If you want to talk directly or discussing some stuff with our speakers today, you can also email them after the session. And now if you could take 2 minutes of your time to fill out our feedback form and talk about what you think about the content or the format, just something for us to improve in the future. Okay, thank you very much for that. We just want to thank everybody for the discussion today. We hope it was helpful and useful for you in your work and research. For us, definitely it was a great learning experience. And we really appreciate Jane, Andy, and Rosa for such insightful talks and presentations. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you both for organising this. It's really, really important discussion.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for coming. Cheers.
And our recordings will be up on our YouTube channel later after the session. And if you want to check it, you can sign up for our YouTube channel, Open the Unopenable. And also we have our previous sessions there. You can check if you're interested in other topics. And just a preview, we have a in-person session in July at the University of Bristol, which we also invited great speakers and panelists for the session. And if you are in Bristol, or if you want to come, please let us know or email us. Later, we will also release our registration on Eventbrite. Okay. All right, thank you all for coming. I think that's the end of our session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.